Well, I'd like to welcome everybody to the Weather Outlook program. If you've got any questions about the weather and what's coming up, just raise your hand right now and we'll start with questions. You're talking. What is your question? The fall temperature she wants to know. The first day of fall or the second? We're having an amazingly normal year, believe it or not. It's got some extremes with a very warm January and February because of Chinook winds. And the Chinook winds were so strong this winter that they reached all the way to Indiana, giving them the warmest winter in history because usually Chinooks don't go that far. When they've got that strength of Chinook, you know that they're getting pounded with snow and rain in California. Put an end to their drought and brought it in to the point that they're having floods in Oregon, Washington, Northern California. And the Chinook that was so strong for the winter was, could have known it without getting any weather reports from out on the West Coast. Lots of interesting things have been going on with the weather. What changed the drought in California? It's called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. That means it goes on for the better part of 10 years. And we could have some more wet conditions on the coast and some warm conditions in the winter here. And that's from here, maybe not all the way to Illinois and Indiana these coming winters, but the possibility is still there. And she was asking about what will fall bring. Looks like normal weather for fall. Expect it to be like fall usually is. A good harvest time as opposed to a wet planting time that we had in most of the Corn Belt. Anyone else got a question they'd like to ask just at the beginning? If I see you talking to each other, I'm going to ask you for what your question is. She says, I sound like a professor. I apologize for that, but I do not throw erasers at you. This is yesterday's corn and soybean market, so I'm going to skip that quickly, except to say that I got 5 phone calls this morning from people saying, okay, corn is pushing that $4.10 line. What should I do? I said, don't ignore it. Because that's a scare price. And so take some advantage of it if you've got corn to sell. And anybody else got a question on what the corn price is doing? People are scared because we're having a heat wave right here, right now. You hardly noticed. But a heat wave with the amount of moisture we've got in the soil for crops that are well established and off to a good start doesn't hurt the plants a bit until it gets over 98 degrees. In fact, the best temperature for plants when we've got healthy plants and good soil moisture is 93. That is the most productive temperature for both corn and soybean, even though you were taught that it was 86. 86 is just the average because usually things aren't ideal. So when the temperature gets above 86, sometimes you start to see leaf rolling, or if it's soybean, leaves lifting up and making the field look silver in the afternoon. And that says the crops are under stress. When you see corn leaves rolled up, see how long it lasts. Every 12 hours that corn leaves are rolled up cuts your yield by 1%. Unless it's within a week of pollination time, and then every 12 hours cuts it by 3%. So you can see just exactly what's happening to crop yields by how long the leaves are rolled or soybeans are lifted, showing the silver in the field. Well, with the prices up around $4.10, that's above what we expect it to be in December. We think it'll be right at $4. That's anticipating that we have a trend line yield. I'm actually saying trend plus 2 bushels right now. I don't know if it'll go higher or lower than that, but that's what the outlook is at the moment. There's the history of what we've had in our in the nation for the last 30 years. The trend line of 30 years is the one you should always use when you're talking about trend lines. Anything else may just be a local trend that happens because of something that's going on either culturally in your area, or it may be something that's happening with the weather that's on a 3 or 4 year schedule rather than the real trend. You notice where it says moderate El Nino on your background pictures here. That with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years of above trend line corn. That's only the second time that that's happened in the last 40 years. We had 7 or even 6 years to be the second time. When I look in the history of the world, it gets you very suspicious when you see 7 good years in a row, because that's when, according to my Sunday school teacher when I was a little kid, Joseph was sold into Egypt with 7 good crop years above trend line yield, followed by 7 of drought. I don't know if that's the kind of thing that happens, but if we're going to have a seriously bad year this century, like on the order of a Dust Bowl year, it will probably be around 2025 if the weather keeps doing what it's done for the last 500 years. That is, the worst year of the century tends to be 89 years after the worst year of the previous century. And so 89 years after 36 is 25, if the weather keeps doing what it's done for so long. So here, lady, this man here in orange has a question. He needs more food up here. Remember, if you talk among yourselves, I know you're asking questions.
My question is, who does your hair?
Who does my hair? The U.S. Army. And you can rest well with the U.S. Army. How many have heard of Cheyenne Mountain and the caves in Cheyenne Mountain? You've seen them in movies. There's a commander of that place that is the most important commander to keep North America safe. That North America would be Mexico. There's 2 generals from Mexico that work there. There's 5 generals from the United States. There's 3 from Canada. For the northern continent, defense is Cheyenne Mountain. One of those generals is my little boy. So I pay close attention to that. And that just because he asked about my haircut. The strong La Nina that you see at the right side of the picture with the drought of 2012. That actually began with the drought of 2011 in South Carolina, Georgia, Texas, and then it moved west from the East Coast to us. It didn't move north from Texas, and then it went on out to California. All of the major droughts in this country start around South Carolina, North Georgia, North Carolina. They all start there and then develop and move west. Some move to Texas, some move across the Corn Belt, but they all start there. We haven't had a drought, a serious drought at least, in history that started in the west and moved east, including the Dust Bowl, including the drought of 88. Many of you remember that. In 87, the drought was so bad in the Carolinas that people from Wisconsin, Michigan, and other places in the Corn Belt donated hay so they could save their breeding stock. The next year, the people in the Carolinas donated hay so we could save the breeding stock in Wisconsin, as the drought had moved from there and then to us and then to California, if us meaning Iowa and the western Corn Belt. That little strong La Nina happens sometimes following a strong El Nino. Sometimes it doesn't. There's more El Nino events than La Nina events. But the La Nina, when it goes on, can just about assure us we're going to have a below trend line yield for corn and soybeans. It's 73% chance of below trend, and it does increase the chance of having a well below trend yield not just a barely. When there's an El Nino going on, we can't count on 6 years in a row of above trendline yields, but you can pretty much count on an El Nino year as being an above trendline yield. So this is worth paying attention to when there's El Nino and La Nina. If you've been watching the world news, you know there's been a lot of flooding in Peru and Ecuador. You got a question? Is it going to be hot all weekend? Warmer than today? Okay. Thank you, Carrie. So we always have something to pay attention to with these El Nino events. Been flooding in Ecuador and Peru, but it's still a small El Nino. It's got to go all the way to the middle of the Pacific Ocean until it has a large enough effect on forming a low pressure there that will determine where the next low pressure is and where the next one is going north to have an effect on our weather. So this one that's been having, though it's been a disaster for Ecuador, is not an El Nino of the strength to guarantee us a favorable year. But it's giving some indications of expanding enough that perhaps it will. And so that is a question now that is being watched. This is the risk wheel. I took a class in risk management some years ago. Most interesting class I have ever taken. I learned something about risk. I'd always heard some people say, you shouldn't invest in that, that's a risky thing. And I say, how risky? And they say, risky, get out of it. I found out when I took a class that risk has numbers. It always has numbers. And I can manage anything with a number. If it's got numbers, we can manage it. If you have no numbers, you can't manage it. Risk has numbers, that's what makes it manageable. If you haven't got the numbers, you're dealing with an uncertainty. You cannot manage uncertainty. All you can do is avoid it. So if someone tells you there's a risk, now I'm going to give you an example that really comes off of this 4-color picture you're looking at. My students always have some field experiments. They raise some little plots of corn. Maybe 3 plots would be in the size of this tent. And after they're all done weighing it and determining what it does, they say, what do we do with this corn, Dr. Taylor? And I say, put it in the pickup and go down to the elevator and sell it to them. Pickup bed holds about 100 bushels. My students went down to the elevator, and the elevator manager came out and said, I see you've got about 100 bushels of corn to sell. And they said, that's right. And he said, I'll give you $3.92 per bushel. And they said, then take 60 of the bushels. He said, I thought you wanted to sell the whole 100. They said, well, not for $3.92. If it was more, we'd sell you more. But we only want to sell 60% at that price. If you were selling corn today because you wanted to move it and they offered you $3.92, how much of the corn you had to sell would you sell to them? 60%. Why? Look at the wheel. What percent of the wheel's to the right of that little blue arrow at the bottom? 60% of it. There's a 60% chance that the next time you have a marketing day and want to sell grain, it's going to be lower in price. So sell the corn, if you're selling corn, that's at risk of going down in price. Or if you're buying because you feed all of your critters, buy the corn for your feed or your feed otherwise, that's at risk of going up in price, and that's how much you buy. Manage the risk. If you know there's a 60% chance the price is going down on the corn you're selling, sell 60% of it now. That means there's a 40% chance it's going up. You kept the 40%, so when the price, if that 40% is what comes true, you had something to sell. People that manage their buying and selling by risk make more money than the way that you're doing it now, assuming you're being honest about it now. And risk management is the way to go. Of course, when I took a risk management class, it was a federally offered class, and when I saw how the federal government manages their money, I doubted the credibility of the thing. Nevertheless, it turned out that the federal government knows what they're doing when they throw all our money away. They are paying attention to the risk. The green is the chance of having a record high yield. And for this year, that would be above 189 bushels to the acre. And you see that says about a 23% chance that that could occur this year. And that could still happen. We're not past that. The wheel will change in about a month and there'll be new risks. The yellow is above trend but not record. And that's a little more than 25% of the wheel. The most likely yield is the very bottom of the circle, which is 2 bushels above the trend. Trend is where blue meets yellow. Red is a drought. These are the risks. The risk changes. If we've got different weather, it changes with the month. When the risk changes, our marketing changes for whether we're buying or selling. And no matter what we're working with, if it's got a risk, get the numbers. If someone says, oh, you're at risk, say, what are the numbers? If they can't tell you, they either aren't your friend or they don't know. And they're not the person you want to get the information from. Get the real risk numbers. One person talked about risk for 3 hours. A person from the markets in Chicago. And at the end, he never mentioned the numbers. He just said, this is risk. We're going to be at greater risk. We're going to be at lesser risk. Any questions? I said, yes, what is the risk right now? He said, what? What are the numbers? He didn't know, or he wouldn't tell. Get the numbers on the risk. That is how they can be managed. Here are the places in the world that we watch the weather when we're interested in what's going to happen to corn and soybeans around the world and some other things as well. You see that little teeny ellipse that's just off Florida, kind of in the middle of the picture. That little teeny ellipse is right over Bermuda. Not because that's where my daughter wanted us all to go on family vacation last year, and we did, but Bermuda is an important place because it gets a high pressure almost every year, right over Bermuda. It's called the Bermuda high pressure. Around a high pressure, the wind blows clockwise if you were up in space looking down on it. And you see the clockwise flow of air pushing the warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico to here. More than 80% of the moisture that falls in the Midwest comes from the Gulf of Mexico. It's pushed up by the Bermuda high pressure. If the Bermuda high pressure doesn't show up, we wouldn't be the breadbasket of the nation. This would be the great desert of North America. But it shows up most years. In '88, it didn't get there till late July instead of the middle of March. And we didn't get normal weather until late July in '88. It was a disastrous drought. Well, we do need the Bermuda high pressure, and normally it gets there somewhere around the middle of March and begins to develop, and we get our normal shift of the winds from the north winds of winter to the southerly winds of summer, bringing the warm, moist air and the precipitation from the Gulf of Mexico. It's about normal this year. Look at the 2 big ellipses there at the left. The bottom one, if that area is all cloudy, then there's a big El Nino going on. Look at the one way over to the right, north of Australia. If that's all clear, it's an especially strong El Nino. If it's the other way around, if it's clear over Australia and cloudy with one place and clear the other, this tells you there's an El Nino or a La Nina going on. And also the place that's cloudy is a low pressure and the other one's a high pressure. And when they reverse, they change the high and low pressures for the better part of the planet. That's why El Nino and La Nina influence us. Right now, it's sort of a neutral situation. Look up at the top ellipse on the left. You see a cloud in there. If at the top there's a lot of counterclockwise flow of air, it looks like kind of a question mark up there at the top, just outside of that ellipse, that says that there's a low pressure in the Gulf of Alaska. If that is still there 6 days from now, don't plan on any rain north of a line from Kansas City to Chicago until it goes away. That is one of the surest things you can get for forecasting precipitation north of a line from Kansas City to Chicago. That's an important part of the Corn Belt. And right now, we're sort of on the edge. That's why there's a scare in the market. And that the prices are up a little bit. Here we're looking again at El Nino conditions. Where the water is colored bright orange, it's very warm. Where it's blue, it's colder than usual. If it was blue inside of the blue ellipse and orange inside of the red ellipse, we would be in a strong El Nino. And you see right now, there's nothing to say strong El Nino. We will be paying attention to it. On this graph, you see that there were times when we were dominated by the red. Looks like we're looking at a stalagmite going up on the top of the picture in red, and stalactites at the bottom. You ever been in caves, saw stalactites and stalagmites? Can you remember which one's which? I'll tell you what my 4th grade student told me. When the mites go up, the tights come down. So we've got stalactites and stalagmites. Anyway, the red things on the top are El Nino events. See the red area when El Nino dominated our climate? And see the blue areas where La Nina did, and which more likely to have bad yields get involved in various areas. We may be moving into a time of greater risk during this next 25 years. The El Nino is our friend if you're a Midwest farmer. Our yields tend to be better. If you're a Northwest United States farmer, Washington, Idaho, adjacent Canada, Montana, adjacent Canada, El Nino's not your friend. La Nina is your friend there. Sometimes we see the temperature of the nation, like it did in 2010, go from cooler than usual west of the Continental Divide to warmer than usual east of it. When the temperature across the nation goes from warmer than normal to cooler than normal, and it divides on the Continental Divide, it tends to stay with us month after month. If it divides anywhere else, it tends to stay with us hour after hour and goes away and moves around. But when it changes on the Continental Divide, you look for something that persists in the weather. The purple line indicates the variability that we see when we've got a La Nina. You might say it's like the path of the jet stream associated with La Nina. The big swings in it bring us big changes in weather, big changes from normal in the weather, hurt crops, hurt animals, hurt things in general. We're adapted to normal weather. The El Nino tends to favor normal conditions. And you see with El Nino or La Nina, the change in the risk wheel, just as an example that I'm showing here. An El Nino to a La Nina occurred 2009 to 2010. Look what happened to the moisture in the Midwest. Went from purple to red. Too much water to too little. It can be a strong thing. Our weather volatility is likely to be greater in the next 20 years than it was in the past 18 years. Here is the volatility graph. You can see volatility right in the middle over 1980 and under the 1925 at the top. Yield from year to year jumping all over the place. The 80s were kind of rough on some people who farmed that weren't managing the risk that went with that kind of thing for one reason or another. Before that, we had 18 years of very consistent yields, increasing, but not jumping all over from year to year. And following that 25 years, they were fairly consistent till the last mark on this graph, which is 2012, when it went down to 137 bushels in the first drought since 1988. 18 consistent years. followed by 25 volatile, followed by 18 consistent, followed by 25 volatile beginning with 2012. When risk management is important to you. It's not so important when you have those consecutive years of about the same yield, just increasing because we have a trend that's up, like you had over 1960 and through the 70s, early 70s. This is a pattern that's gone on in the Midwest for over 500 years. 25 years of volatile weather, 18 years of consistent. It's a fairly normal thing to expect. Volatile years don't mean that you're going to lose money. They mean you're going to lose money if you don't know how to work with volatility. The first time I was invited to speak to the directors of the Board of Trade, they said, we want you to talk for 15 minutes, so we're going to ask you questions for 45. And in their 45 minutes of questions, every question included the word volatility. That's how they make their money in Chicago, from the ups and downs of the prices. Guess how you make money in agriculture? Whether it's raising livestock or raising grain, you make your money or lose your money depending on how you handle the ups and downs of the prices. If Chicago can make money off volatility, you can as well. But I can't compete with those guys. They delay the markets 10 or 15 minutes before I even see them. That's right. Don't try to compete with them on a minute-to-minute basis, an hour-to-hour, week-to-week. They can't compete with you on a year-to-year basis, and you can't compete with them on a minute-to-minute basis. Each work with your own volatility. There's no reason not to have a higher profit margin in the years where we had all those ups and downs of yield and ups and downs of prices than there is for the guys in Chicago. You can make more money with the greater variation if you're managing the risk. That's all I'm going to say about that, except for my fourth grade teacher who told us to do that. And I thought, Miss Hatch, if you're so smart, why aren't you rich? And then the county library burned down and she built a new one and filled it with books. How did a fourth grade teacher in the early 1950s come up with the money without inheriting it to build a library? She told us, students, when you've got something to sell, if the price is high, sell it. If the price is low, buy it back. And when the price goes up, sell it again. And she built the library. And maybe she built the markets in Chicago. And the success of the farmers. At least I know her kids turned out to be successful farmers. So I've already mentioned the Continental Divide. In the years when it divides the nation from wet to dry, from hot to cool, it's almost sure that you can go with that picture at the beginning will last probably through the year. But that's the only time. We now look at the 6 to 10 day forecast. Warmer than usual. Well, I can believe that for the next 6 to 10 days for us. And the people in Washington and Oregon and Idaho, colder than usual. They say wetter than usual here. They got that wrong, I think. But that was their idea. Definitely dry in Texas and up into Colorado, where they've been getting rain, and we've been getting a little bit dry. And I know the reason they made the mistake on that, but still, that is their outlook. It's an outlook, not a forecast. Our forecasts are controlled by law in this country. If it's a forecast, it's got to be right more than 80% of the time. If it isn't right more than 80% of the time, it's illegal to call it a forecast. If you're a federal employee, you can call it anything you want. But the federal employees can only call it a forecast if it's proven right more than 80% of the time. If it's not that, then you call it an outlook. They have to be right more than 60% of the time. If it's not right 60% of the time, you can just call it there may be a trend coming. At least those are the things that I was taught when I was employed by the National Weather Service. Well, this is our outlook. This is our year. Likely to be slightly above trend line crop yield. It could change because this is an important month. June is an important month, and the first 2 weeks of July. Usually by then we know. But that's the way things look at the moment.